Freeman founded FEATBC in 1996, so that's 11 or 12 years, well, 12 years ago. After returning to Canada from Stanford, where she received her doctorate in sociology. She is a social scientist and the author of the popular books Teach Me Language, the one I just mentioned, Science for Sale, The Autism Wars, which she's providing free of charge today. She has also just published, again, the bigger book I just showed you, The Complete Guide to Autism Treatments, A Parent's Handbook. This book is an absolute must-read for every parent with a newly diagnosed child. It can be ordered online at Sabrina's webpage, which is skfbooks.com. Sabrina is also preparing to launch a line of attractive women's bracelets under the Snip Snip Baby label, ideal to send to your least favorite politician. Prior to BC was, British Columbia was a treatment-free zone. Since 1996, Sabrina has been a tireless advocate for the rights of children with autism to science-based treatment. It was largely her vision and tenacity which initiated both the Autism and the HUCO litigations. Thank you, Sabrina. Today's access to science-based treatment and limited treatment funding are the direct result of those litigations and Sabrina's work. For the last 10 years, Sabrina has volunteered thousands of hours talking to and advising parents on how to help their children. She's produced videotapes, written endless briefs, and attended hundreds of meetings, directed the legal steering committees for Autism and HUCO, and she's done all of this and more, and all for one thing, all for our children. In 2002, she was awarded Queen Elizabeth's 50th Gold Jubilee Medal for advocacy. I've been told by many parents that Sabrina is owed a debt of gratitude which cannot be repaid. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sabrina Freeman.
Thanks very much. Yes, well, it's been 12 long years since FEATBC launched the battle to have our children's core needs met under the Health Care Act. I'll give you all a brief history, since many of your children were not even born then. And back then I wasn't even wearing glasses, and my 9-year-old child wasn't born. We started the battle when I returned to Canada in 1995 after completing graduate work in the States, in California. And I came home to a system that didn't even have the word autism in any government program. After intensive targeted lobbying at the provincial level, it was apparent that there was no one on the government side prepared to listen to us about the plight of our children. There was no one on the government side even prepared to admit that effective treatment even exists. They'd speak of means-tested support. We'd speak of universally accessible, publicly funded treatment. We didn't even have a common language. 2 ships passing in the night. It became abundantly clear, pretty quickly, that we needed a third party to establish the rights for our children. So we went to BC Supreme Court just to do that. And that case, as you all know, is the landmark Autism case. And what the Autism case did was truly revolutionary. It essentially served as a commission of inquiry that was forced upon government. All the facts were put on the table for close scrutiny. All the government's spin, all their neglect, their intransigence, it was all set out there in the light of day, and it didn't cut it in front of the judge. The government had to show everything they did for kids with autism, and at the end of the day, the judge said, "You have nothing." A failed system was completely exposed, and exposed to the light of day, which, as we all know, bureaucrats hate. So the court concluded that we're right, and they're wrong. There is indeed effective autism treatment, and the government must pay. Even the BC Court of Appeal, they agreed, and they threw the book at the government. And they said the government must provide effective autism treatment, which is intensive behavioral treatment, or ABA. Now at this point, the government was kind of getting a little nervous. And the government-owned health policy academics, they were actually losing the battle to keep our kids out of the healthcare system. So what did they do? they redoubled their efforts. And they introduced new biased evidence in the Supreme Court of Canada. And they argued incorrectly that intensive behavioral treatment is novel, emergent, and experimental. And in addition, every province in this country lined up against us, including the feds at the Supreme Court of Canada level. So based on biased research, the Supreme Court of Canada washed their hands of our children, and in the process, they gutted the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for disabled people in this country, not just children with autism, but disabled people in general. And they tossed the whole issue back to the laps of the lawmakers. They said, this is not a legal issue, this is a political issue. So we started to get political at the federal level. So since that time, we've had hundreds of petitions tabled by MPs across the country asking the government to include our kids in Medicare. That's gone nowhere. We had a private member's bill which would have legally included our children in Medicare. That was defeated by government. We then had a private member's non-binding motion presented to Parliament to include our kids in Medicare, and it passed over a year ago. It's been thoroughly ignored. Nothing's happened. Our advocacy also helped create an autism-specific inquiry in the Senate. They submitted a final report called Pay Now or Pay Later that recommended a national autism strategy to include our kids in healthcare with uniform national standards, instead of this patchwork that we have across the country that's generally administered by the Ministry of Poverty and means tested. So guess what? That's been thoroughly ignored and nothing's happened. It has become abundantly clear that we need to get the attention and the cooperation of more politicians. So that's why I suggested in the last election that my colleague Jean Lewis run for Parliament, run to be a member of Parliament. Because then once in power, if we had somebody in power, she wouldn't be bamboozled by the biased academics. So we need to get the attention of the politicians, but we also need to educate them on a simple fact, and that is that listening to and believing government-owned academics will not be good for their political careers. There's got to be a competition of ideas in Canadian health policy. Right now there's no competition for this small group of wholly owned government academics. They have a monopoly of ideas. As long as we don't have a competition in health policy, nothing will change in Medicare for our children. So for every government report that says intensive behavioral intervention is experimental, we need a competing academic report saying it's best practice. A health policy institute that is entirely independent of government is what is desperately needed in Canada. So, step one is to get the right politicians elected and for them to understand which side their bread is buttered on. And step two is to get those politicians to go to non-government owned academics to tell them the truth, which is that intensive behavioral treatment is best practice for children with autism. It's been an honor and it's been a privilege for the last dozen years to lead this movement. We've made a lot of progress and we've laid many important foundations. But this will be a long struggle. And we need a new generation of advocates like yourselves, all of you who came out today, to carry the fight forward from where we leave off so that finally our children will enter Medicare like every other Canadian. Thank you.